Alright, so I've gotten quite a few requests now to explain the new combat system and the changes in this most recent update, so I thought I'd make a video on it. Now, I know when this was announced, a lot of people thought this was going to be totally game-changing and game-breaking, and honestly, it isn't. I mean, a few things change on a fundamental level, but it's still the same combat system at its core, to be honest. It isn't totally changing the dynamics of the game. There's a few key changes which you can play around and work with, but it's still the same as it used to be, really. So before, in this situation, Seg, Andrea and Chris would get 33% of the infantry here in their groups. They'd split it like 3 ways between them, and then Julian and Annie would split the spearmen 50-50 between them, and then all these cavalry units would have no commander. They wouldn't be in any group at all, which means all these cavalry units would contribute nothing towards commander damage from the active abilities, because there'd be nothing to trigger it. Whereas now, all units are split 20% across all 5 commanders, regardless of their unit type, and commanders no longer use their respective troop type to do commander damage. They just pull the attack stats from all the troops in their group and then do commander damage based on those attack stats, but with the countering of their own commander type. So here, Julian would pull the attack stats from the spearmen, the cavalry, and the infantry, and then do spearmen damage with those attack stats. And Chris would do the same and do infantry damage. Before, if you sent 5 commanders of the same type, the 5th would not fight or use their active ability because they wouldn't have a grouped command. It was limited to a maximum of 4 groups per unit type, so there would be a 5th commander which just wouldn't have a grouped command. Whereas now, if you send a full spear rally with 5 spearman commanders, for example, all 5 commanders would do damage normally, which they wouldn't before. This does add some intricacies to PvP, honestly, because you can now build your account towards 2 unit types, for example, in terms of buffs, but use total attack commanders on the 3rd unused unit type, and have their active abilities cover the 3rd counter if you're sending like blind attacks and just wanting to cover all your options. So when Arya gets awakened in a few days, or whenever that's coming out, you could run, say, Seg and Arya along with Gorel, Annie, Miranda, for example, in a spear cav march, and have cav attack on your refinement, and you'll still get value from that just from the cavalry units hitting themselves, but you'll now get value from the commanders too, even if you don't have a cavalry commander there, because they'll still pull damage from that cavalry attack. It'll just do damage based on the commander's counter type instead. So you can definitely play around that now, because before it was a lot more restrictive, whereas now you could, run spear cav but still do a fairly decent amount of infantry damage if you run into like a spear front, which you would not be able to do before at all. This does hugely buff total attack commanders, especially the likes of Theon and Cersei, if you're playing around them, because before you probably weren't running bows at all, so their active abilities were just entirely wasted, whereas now you can consistently get value out of them. Another subtle change in terms of the practicality of this is these lines can be broken through a little easier now, and damage to the 2nd row happens a little bit more often. Because before, if you were imp front, like here, all your infantry would just be hit until they were all defeated. But now, it still works that way, but in groups of 5, so the infantry is like segmented. So if you had a cavalry commander, for example, hitting one group, which we don't have here to show, they will break through the infantry faster than a group with Julian and Annie in it, because the active ability will be doing so much more damage against the infantry as opposed to the spearmen, because the cavalry will get the counter bonus on their active ability, whereas the spearman will get countered. So that can potentially add a bit more complexity to fighting. It could slightly increase the value of total health and defense, and you might want to send a bit more meat shield on your second row because of this, especially if you're like a lower spending player and you can't really afford to consistently heal tier 4s or take tier 4 deaths. But it isn't that major a change. In the past KVK I was hitting people quite recklessly with solos, and it still felt fairly similar. With these changes, it is quite a big buff to defending. Rally tanking is a bit easier now, which could potentially over these next few months change the meta of the game. I think a lot of people are set in their ways right now in terms of blankable castles, like even max accounts like Napoleon dropping down to be able to zero out his troops. Tanking rallies will probably be a fair bit easier now, but it's probably still at the point when no one can tank the double, triple rallies from max accounts no matter how big you are. This battle log has gone a bit more complicated and there's a bit more detail in it now too. You know, it shows all these groups hitting the other groups, which is very complex. You can see the counter system quite well. Like here, for example, where this is into a spear front, Julian does that much damage, and then Andrea counters, so you can see how it does double the damage as the spear into spear. And if there was a cavalry, it would do like 6,400. So neutral does 100%, and then counter does double damage, and then countered does half damage from that base value. So it's quite nice to be able to see that in such a simple way. But I wouldn't overthink any of this too much, really. I know it's quite intimidating, especially with the likes of this new battle log. Like, this is so complicated if you have no idea what you're looking at. It can seem so much more daunting than it actually is. I think the main takeaways from it is total attack is buffed. The likes of Annie and Julian as commanders, you can run them in every formation. That is a big buff to mid spenders. Defending is buffed. Second row health is probably slightly more valuable, but it's negligible. The total health, total defense maybe a bit better, but still not a priority for anyone in all likelihood. Yeah, there we go. There's the new combat system.